We all know of the wondrous stories of the Sierra Nevada, its transcendent beauty, its inspirational qualities, its extraordinary natural diversity. But some Sierra stories are largely unknown and just plain out of the ordinary. Here are a few unusual tales of the Sierra Nevada.
Celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, later celebrated in Mark Twain's famous story, the International Frog Jump gets underway at Angels Camp, California.
It seems that everyone knows about the Frog Jump Jubilee held annually at Angels Camp. Every year, thousands descend on the little foothill town to watch the International Frog Jumping Competition. It is all over the news and has been for years, including this newsreel from the 1950s. And certainly, if you visit Angels Camp, the reminders are everywhere. Books, pictures, winners' plaques embedded in the sidewalks, statues of Mark Twain and artistically decorated frogs, banners, street signs with frog cartoons, historical markers, songs, even a downtown monument to the frog. But not many people know why the event occurred in the first place. And it really has very little to do with frogs. Since Gold Rush days, the unpaved streets of Angels Camp were in awful shape. Deeply rutted dirt and often muddy thoroughfares interlaced the hamlet. By 1927, the residents were fed up and passed a bond measure to finance a paved main street, as shown in these photographs from 1928. The Angels Camp Boosters, a community service organization, felt that a party was in order, a glorious celebration of the road finally being paved. Their original concept was to celebrate the town's Gold Rush heritage, but a visitor to town suggested they resurrect Mark Twain's 1865 story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and used that as the theme. The Boosters agreed, and on May 19th and 20th, 1928, the first Frog Jumping Jubilee was held on the newly paved Main Street in downtown Angels Camp. The attendance at the first Jumping Frog Jubilee was estimated to be 15,000. Except for 1933, when the event was suspended in the depths of the Great Depression, the Frog Jump has been held annually ever since. So, let's hear it for the frogs. Oh, and for the pavement, too. We have all heard those stirring words, "go to warp speed," in a Star Trek TV episode or film. And most of us know that it refers to faster-than-light transport. But it would not mean anything if we did not know the speed of light, 186,282 miles per second. And for that, we can thank a resident of Murphy's and Virginia City. His name was Albert Abraham Michelson, and as a young boy and teenager in the 1850s and 1860s, he lived in the Sierra Nevada mining camp of Murphy's, California, and just over the range in Virginia City, Nevada. Michelson was born in Poland in 1852 and emigrated to the United States at the age of 2. Always fascinated by science, Albert was awarded an appointment to the United States Naval Academy by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1869. Michelson would later teach at the Academy. Michelson is best known as the physicist who worked on the precise measurement of the speed of light. In 1907, he received the Nobel Prize in Physics. He was the first American to receive the Nobel Prize in the Sciences. He died in 1931. Here in this clip from a 1930s newsreel, an uncomfortable Michelson describes his work.
First of these was the measurement of the velocity of light. The second, the measurement of the diameter of a star. And the third was a test of the Einstein theory of relativity.
For a later generation, Michelson became part of popular culture. In a 1962 episode of Bonanza entitled "Look to the Stars," Michelson's story in Virginia City was recounted. So, the next time we hear that majestic command, "Maximum warp, Mr. Sulu," give a silent thank you to the man who helped make those words possible, Albert Michelson. The first full-length feature film made in the Sierra Nevada was a monumental effort and is an ongoing Hollywood legend. And full length does not start to describe this movie. Its title was Greed, and it was nearly 10 hours long in its original form. A silent film classic, it was a very faithful adaptation of the novel McTeague by Frank Norris. The 1924 film featured this memorable final scene of the fatal battle between the title character McTeague and his enemy Marcus. It was shot in Death Valley in very harsh conditions. Other scenes were shot in Placer County and in San Francisco. Directed by the eccentric and demanding Erich von Stroheim, the film cost $500,000 to produce, an astoundingly expensive amount for the time. At its initial length, it would have to be shown over 2 days in theaters. Greed was shown only once in its original 10-hour length to meet contractual obligations. Then it was cut, and then cut again, until it ended up at about 2.5 hours long. Most of the cut film was accidentally destroyed by a janitor who tossed what he thought was unimportant film into an incinerator. As a result, Greed is considered one of the great lost films in cinema history. A full-length restoration is impossible, but recently, Turner Entertainment fashioned a version of the movie that used still photographs to replace some of the lost footage. It was still about 6 hours shorter than the original. The dream of flight is as old as humanity. Even during the California Gold Rush days, Argonauts hoped for a quicker route to the goldfields. This guy, a guy named Mr. Golightly, even advertised this contraption, which promised a rocket-powered journey to the mother lode. Didn't exist, but a wondrous thought. So what does this have to do with the Sierra Nevada, you might ask? The question is, who was the first to fly an airplane? There is a Sierra connection. For many, the answer, of course, is the Wright brothers. Their 1903 flight in Kitty Hawk is widely considered the dawn of mechanized air travel. But there may have been, emphasize may have been, an earlier pilot, Lyman Gilmore of Grass Valley. In 1902, Gilmore built a 32-foot plane that was powered by a steam engine. These are some schematics for the craft. At that time, no one had yet attained mechanized flight. In May of that year, Gilmore claimed that he successfully flew his steam airplane well in advance of the Wrights. Few, if any, witnesses claimed to be present, and many figured that Gilmore had never flown. Even Gilmore's family had their doubts. Lyman was by all accounts reclusive and secretive, which did not help his cause. He continued experimenting, however, and soon afterward produced a large fuselage and closed cabin monster that in all probability no contemporary engine on Earth could have possibly lifted. This aircraft is shown here in this vintage footage. The two men shown are Lyman and his brother Charles. Gilmore continued to press his claim that he was the first to fly, but few credited him. But Gilmore did have a more substantial argument that he built the first commercial airport in the world. Others more modestly felt Gilmore's airfield was more likely to have been the first airport in the United States or in the American West, but this documented accomplishment was significant regardless of scope. Gilmore was a pilot, but no solid evidence exists that any of his machines was the vehicle used. After World War I, Gilmore staged air shows at his Grass Valley Aerodrome that featured exhibitions by famous aviators. The hangars bordering the runways presented public displays of Gilmore's flying machines. Lyman Gilmore ran his airport and dabbled in experimental aircraft for the rest of his life. He never dropped his assertion that he was the first man to fly a powered aircraft. In 1935, sadly, his airplanes and hangars were destroyed by fire. Today, Lyman Gilmore's airport is the location of Lyman Gilmore School in Grass Valley. If you look carefully, you can still see remnants of the runways. A large, colorful mural depicting Gilmore's aviation adventures graces the side of one school building. There are only a few spots in the American West where you see a conjunction of all the major themes of the history of the West. One of these places is Auburn. Here we see the minglings of the stories of the westward movement, as Auburn is on a tentacle of the California Trail. The Transcontinental Railroad, as the city is a major stop on the route. There is the gold rush, of course. And surprisingly, as we shall see, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And all of these threads can be found in one person who lived and worked in Auburn, a person who was known as Pompey. His actual name was Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. We don't have any images of Jean-Baptiste as an adult, but we certainly know a lot about him as a child. Jean-Baptiste was born in North Dakota during the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. He was the son of the expedition's Native American guide, Sacagawea. His father, the French-Canadian trapper Toussaint Charbonneau, was an interpreter on the journey. The baby, just an infant, was called Little Pomp or Pompey by William Clark, and traveled with his mother on the expedition, frequently carried on her back. Pompey's image can be found on the Sacagawea dollar coin. He is the only child ever depicted on American currency. The rock formation called Pompey's Pillar on the Yellowstone River in Montana is named for him. William Clark even signed the rock, as shown here. Soon after the conclusion of the expedition in 1806, Jean-Baptiste began residing with Clark in St. Louis. William Clark paid for his education, including schooling in Missouri and in Europe. The now not-so-little Pompey traveled throughout Europe and northern Africa for 6 years. In 1829, Jean-Baptiste returned to the United States to work as a fur trapper and hunting guide. He did this for years until 1846, when he was hired as a scout for General Stephen Kearny's Mexican War expedition to California. In 1847, Jean-Baptiste worked for Colonel John Stevenson at California's Mission San Luis Rey. It was Stevenson who would play a large part in the founding and naming of Auburn. In September 1848, Charbonneau arrived in Placer County, near what is now called Auburn, a tiny mining community named by many members of Stevenson's regiment who were natives of Auburn, New York. Jean-Baptiste settled at a site today known as Secret Ravine, one of 12 ravines in and around Auburn. He was a semi-successful miner who stayed in Auburn for the next 16 years. He lasted that long because he quickly realized that to survive in the gold rush town, he had to do something in addition to mining, a notoriously fickle pursuit. Charbonneau worked as hotel manager of the Orleans Hotel in what is now Old Town Auburn. The hotel would be rebuilt years later, and it looked like this in its future incarnation. In April 1866, for reasons that are still unclear, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau left Auburn for Montana, most likely to prospect for gold. Only a few weeks later, Charbonneau died en route to Montana in eastern Oregon. The reports were unclear as to the cause of his death. It may have been a fall from his horse, or a wagon accident in a river, or inhaling alkali dust, or pneumonia, or, well, you get the idea. We just don't know for sure. Jean-Baptiste is buried near Danner, Oregon, and several historic monuments erected by historical societies, civic organizations, and Native American groups mark the spot. But the memory of the famous little boy who, as an adult adventurer, lived at the confluence of American Western history in Auburn lives on. So perhaps we should have a little ceremony for Jean-Baptiste. What do you say? Here's to Pompey. If a vote was taken to identify the most influential figure in Sierra Nevada history that you never heard of, quite likely the winner would be John Kanessa. Really? John Kanessa, you might ask. Who's that? Well, you are looking at his handiwork, Yosemite. Kanessa was a major player in the establishment of Yosemite and in forging the principle that led to its ultimate status as a national park. Still never heard of him? You are not alone, as evidenced by this clip from a 1940s educational film.
This is Yosemite, crown jewel of the national parks. But do you know who was responsible for the founding of Yosemite? Perhaps we can get some answers at Joe's radio shop.
Surely you know about John Kanessa and Yosemite.
Nah. Is he an old guy like you? No, I don't know. And don't call me Shirley.
So you see, the story of John Kanessa is largely lost in the shadows today, but his impact continues to resonate throughout the world. This is his story. John Kanessa was born in Ireland in 1821 and emigrated to the United States in 1836. Barely surviving in New York City, John Kanessa joined the thousands of hopeful gold seekers headed to California in 1849. As did many other 49ers, Kanessa found gold mining a difficult pursuit, and he ultimately became a merchant in the Little Sierra community of Georgetown. Kanessa operated a store selling supplies to miners. California was a new state in the 1850s, and Kanessa gravitated toward politics. Kanessa served in the California State Legislature and ran, unsuccessfully, for lieutenant governor and governor in 1859 and 1861. In 1863, John Kanessa was selected by the California State Legislature to serve as the state's United States Senator. On March 28, 1864, Kanessa introduced a bill, this bill, Senate Bill 203, the Yosemite Valley Grant Act. The legislation would, by federal action, grant to the state of California the Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Grove of big trees. In the debate on the bill, Kanessa famously stated that the grant areas would be, in his words, for all public purposes worthless, but constitute perhaps some of the greatest wonders of the world. The object and purpose is to make a grant to the state on the stipulation contained in the bill that the property shall be inalienable forever and preserved and improved as a place of public resort, unquote. No money was appropriated in support of the bill, and no supporting legislation provided for federal administration of the areas. It did not establish the national park. That came later in 1890, but it did institute the concept that protecting places of natural beauty should be a national priority, an idea that led to the founding of the first national park anywhere on Earth at Yellowstone in 1872, an inspiration that would spread to the rest of the world, arguably the best American export. The Yosemite Valley Grant Act passed, and on June 30, 1864, during the depths of the bloody Civil War, it was signed by President Abraham Lincoln. Kanessa and Lincoln held each other in high regard. In fact, Kanessa was a pallbearer at Abraham Lincoln's funeral in 1865. John Kanessa only served one term in the Senate. He retired to Boston, Massachusetts, and lived into the 20th century. He died at the ripe old age of 87 in 1909. John Kanessa is commemorated by several landmarks in the Sierra Nevada, including the nearly 13,000-foot Mount Kanessa near the Yosemite boundary and the Kanessa Glacier. Not bad for a guy no one knows about today. Josiah Whitney was smart, no doubt about it. As a prominent world-renowned scientist, professor at Harvard, and the California state geologist, Whitney was widely admired. They even named a mountain after him, Mount Whitney. But sometimes old Josiah would say things that at best were head-scratchers, and to be blunt, were sometimes just flat wrong. A couple of them were about Yosemite Valley, the locale of this tale. Among Whitney's contentions was that Yosemite Valley was formed in one cataclysmic moment when the valley floor suddenly dropped. When later investigations by John Muir, shown here with some of his scientific drawings, demonstrated that the valley was actually formed by eons-long glacial action, Whitney derided Muir as, in his words, a mere sheepherder and an ignoramus. Very diplomatic of you, Josiah. Today, Muir's theory is accepted, and Whitney's has been roundly dismissed. But another of Whitney's Yosemite Valley assertions is the actual focus of this tale. In 1870, in his position as state geologist, Whitney stated that Half Dome, in his words, never has been and never will be trodden by human foot, and that the summit of the great granite monolith was, again in his own words, perfectly inaccessible. But was Josiah Whitney correct? Was Half Dome impossible to climb? The man who lived in this cabin in Yosemite Valley thought otherwise. His name was George Anderson, a Scotsman who was working in the valley. Anderson believed the glacially polished surface of Half Dome could be managed and the seemingly inaccessible summit could be reached. Anderson was not the first to attempt the climb, however. Earlier, John Conway, another resident of the valley, had dispatched some climbers to make the ascent. One account refers to them as a flock of small boys who climbed smooth rocks like lizards. They made it part way up, but could not make the final steep, slick journey to the top, and they abandoned the effort. So, now comes George Anderson. In October 1875, Anderson successfully reaches the top of Half Dome, and how he does it is remarkable and downright scary. Anderson, barefooted, started up the final grade by drilling holes in the granite and inserting iron eye bolts. This is an actual Anderson eye bolt, and looping rope through the bolt. He would then stand on the eye bolt he had just placed and drill the hole for the next one, insert another bolt, loop the rope, and so on and on, upward, ever upward, about 1,000 feet in total. It took George Anderson several days, but finally, as one report stated, with dint of pluck, unswerving perseverance, and personal daring, Anderson reached his goal at 3:00 p.m. on October 12, 1875. Here is a photograph of Anderson standing on the lip of Half Dome. Soon others would follow. A group of English tourists, these tourists, scrambled up Half Dome using Anderson's rope within days of Anderson's success. And a day or two after that, adventurous Sarah Dutcher was the first female to climb the rock. Dutcher worked in the valley selling photographs. And Sarah, as have many before and since, came to Yosemite from far away to experience the valley. In her case, via Tasmania and Honolulu. George Anderson, it is said, hoped to capitalize on his success by building a staircase to the top of Half Dome and escorting tourists to the summit, for a fee, of course. Anderson worked on the staircase, but it was frustrating and unsuccessful, as massive snowstorms would sweep away any progress he had made. Anderson would contract pneumonia and die in 1884 at the age of 47. He is buried in the Yosemite Pioneer Cemetery, appropriately in the shadow of Half Dome. Today, thousands of Yosemite visitors ascend Half Dome annually using the cable pathway to the summit. While access is limited primarily to the summer months, the numbers climbing Whitney's perfectly inaccessible granite monolith can number in the hundreds daily, causing a hiking traffic jam on those warm Yosemite days. So I guess the moral of our story is, never say never. Or perhaps, never say never, Josiah. We hope you have enjoyed these unusual tales of the Sierra Nevada. Now, we urge you to follow John Muir's Sierra suggestion. climb the mountains, and get their good tidings. See you down the trail. To learn more about Sierra Nevada history and literature, we recommend The Illuminated Landscape, a Sierra Nevada anthology, co-published by Sierra College Press, Heyday Books, and Santa Clara University.